Some nights in history were heavier than others, nights when people went to sleep believing they would never wake up again. Imagine lying on a straw mattress, the smell of smoke in the air, church bells tolling somewhere in the dark, convinced that by morning the sky itself would tear open. No more seasons, no more tomorrows, just the end. As the year 1000 approached, this fear crept quietly across Europe. It did not arrive like a scream, it arrived like a whisper. Priests spoke of signs. Chroniclers wrote about strange lights in the sky, earthquakes and comets that seemed to hang too long above the earth. Many believed the world had a deadline, and that deadline was close. Very close. A monk named Raoul Glaber described crowds filling churches night after night. People confessed sins they barely remembered committing. Land was donated. Enemies were forgiven. Some farmers even stopped planting crops because what was the point of preparing for a harvest that would never come? When you're certain the world is ending, planning feels almost disrespectful. And yet beneath the fear there was something else. Hope. A strange, fragile hope that maybe the end would also be a beginning. That suffering would finally stop. That history itself would close its eyes and rest. But here is the part no one could predict. The night passed. Morning came. The sky stayed where it was. Before we continue walking through this strange moment together, if you feel yourself settling into the story, you might gently show your support by liking the video or joining the channel. And if you feel comfortable, leave a comment about where you're listening from tonight. A bedroom, a long drive, a quiet corner of the world. Now let your shoulders relax, let the noise fade and stay with me. Because the most interesting part of this story is not that the world almost ended, it is that it did not. When nothing happened, there were no celebrations in the streets, no cheering, just confusion. Awkward, unsettling confusion. People had prepared their hearts for an ending, and instead they were handed an ordinary day. Bread still needed baking, animals still needed feeding. Life asked to continue as if nothing had happened, and that quiet disappointment changed everything. Because when the end fails to arrive, belief begins to shift. Trust begins to loosen. People start asking questions they never dared to ask before. If the world did not end when we were promised it would, then what else might not be as fixed, as certain, as eternal as we were told? That question lingered in the air unspoken but powerful. And as we move forward, we'll see how that single unanswered question slowly reshaped faith power and the everyday lives of ordinary people in ways they could never have imagined. What followed that quiet, ordinary morning was not relief, but something heavier. It felt like standing up too quickly after a long prayer and realizing the world was still spinning. Medieval writers rarely use the word disappointment, but you can feel it between the lines of their records. People had prepared for the end of everything. Instead, they were asked to return to their lives as if nothing had happened. In monasteries across France and Germany, scribes noted a strange silence. Sermons about the end of days slowly disappeared. Some priests avoided the topic altogether. Others spoke cautiously, reminding their listeners that no one truly knows the hour. For ordinary people, this was unsettling. If the most confident voices could be wrong about the biggest question of all, what else might be uncertain? Imagine the emotional whiplash. You sell your land, you forgive your enemies, you confess every secret. Then suddenly you still have decades ahead of you. What do you build your life on now? A few chroniclers mention people feeling embarrassed by their fear. Others describe a quiet anger. Not at God exactly, but at authority. At certainty itself. A belief that once felt solid now felt fragile like clay that had dried unevenly and cracked in the sun. This emotional shift mattered more than any single event. It taught people slowly and painfully that survival could feel like failure, that continuing to live required a new kind of courage, one that did not rely on prophecy but on patience. There is even a hint of dark humour in later writings. One text jokes about farmers who stopped planting crops and then had to borrow grain from neighbours who did not panic. History, it seems, was already learning to laugh gently at itself. Have you ever prepared yourself for something life-changing only to have it quietly not happen? That strange mix of relief and emptiness is not new. Medieval people felt it too, and in that emptiness something subtle began to grow. A willingness to question, a need to rebuild meaning without a clear ending in sight. That inner shift, almost invisible at first, would soon spill outward into daily life, reshaping how power worked, how labour was valued, and how ordinary people saw their place in the world. Little by little, that quiet doubt stepped out of people's hearts and into their everyday routines. Not loudly, not violently, more like a door left slightly open. The old rules were still there, written in law and stone, but they no longer felt unmovable. You can see it most clearly in work. For centuries, medieval society ran on certainty. A peasant was born a peasant. A lord was born a lord. That was the order of things said to be chosen by God himself. But after generations of failed predictions, famines and sudden losses, people began to notice something uncomfortable. The world continued, but the rules bent. When labour became scarce during crises like the Great Famine of the early 14th century, surviving workers realised they had leverage. Fields still needed hands, workshops still needed skill. In England, records show wages rising despite laws trying to freeze them. In towns across Europe, people moved more freely, changing masters, changing cities, changing lives. Not because they were rebellious by nature, but because survival demanded flexibility. Even within families, things shifted. Women who had lost husbands managed land and businesses longer than before. Young people delayed marriage, waiting for stability rather than tradition. None of this was announced as a revolution. It simply happened quietly, one decision at a time. There is a certain irony here. The world did not end, but the idea that life had to stay exactly the same did. People began trusting experience over promises. What worked mattered more than what was expected. Have you ever noticed how rules feel strongest right before they begin to loosen? Medieval society was feeling that tension. Authority still existed, but it had to negotiate now. It had to explain itself. This slow reshaping of daily life created something new. A sense that the future was not fixed, that it could be influenced, nudged, even argued with. And once people feel that, they rarely forget it. As these changes settled into streets and fields, another question quietly emerged. If old structures could bend, could old explanations bend too? And that question would soon lead people to search for meaning in places they had never dared to look before. As those everyday changes settled in, something even deeper began to shift, almost unnoticed at first. People started asking not just how to live differently, but how to understand the world differently. When predictions failed and old rules bent, explanations suddenly mattered more than ever. Faith did not disappear. Medieval people did not wake up one morning and abandon belief. But belief became more careful, less loud, less absolute. Priests began choosing their words with caution. Sermons spoke more about living well in the present than about counting the days until the end. A quiet humility entered religious life, shaped by the memory of being wrong. At the same time, curiosity found small cracks to grow through. In cities like Bologna and Paris, scholars returned to observation. Medical writers began describing symptoms instead of only quoting scripture. During outbreaks of disease, some towns experimented with isolation, closing gates, separating the sick from the healthy. Venice later formalised this idea with waiting periods for ships 40 days before entry. It was not perfect, and it was not gentle, but it was new. It was people admitting that prayer alone did not explain everything. Even nature itself felt different. Eclipses and comets were still frightening, but they were also recorded more carefully. Dates, movements, patterns. The sky became something to watch, not just fear. It was the beginning of a long conversation between belief and evidence, not a battle, but a negotiation. There is a quiet humour in this moment of history. Humanity expected the end of the world and instead discovered homework, notes to take, questions to ask, responsibilities to manage. Have you ever noticed how uncertainty pushes us to pay closer attention? Medieval people were doing exactly that. Not because they wanted to challenge faith, but because faith alone had not answered everything. This search for meaning did not explode into instant enlightenment. It unfolded slowly like dawn light across stone walls. But once people began looking for understanding instead of endings, they could not fully look away again. And as we move toward the final part of this story, we begin to see the full shape of what happened. The world continued, yes, but humanity stepped onto a slightly different path, one shaped not by catastrophe, but by survival and the quiet courage to keep asking why. By this point, the change was no longer just internal. It was visible, audible, written into the rhythms of everyday life. People no longer waited for the world to end. They prepared for it to continue. You can hear this shift in the language of town records and personal letters. Instead of obsessing over signs in the sky, writers focused on contracts, apprenticeships, marriages, repairs. Mundane details, yes, but deeply revealing. Attention had moved from prophecy to planning, from endings to endurance. Cities expanded cautiously. Stone replaced wood after devastating fires. Market rules became more detailed. Guilds formed not only to control trade, but to protect members against uncertainty. When life proves unpredictable, cooperation suddenly feels wise. Even time itself felt different. Medieval clocks began appearing in public squares, dividing the day into regular hours. Not God's time, human time, measured, shared, organized. It was a quiet declaration that the future mattered enough to be scheduled. There is something tender here. After standing at the edge of imagined extinction, people chose responsibility. They chose continuity. They chose to care again. That choice, repeated thousands of times by ordinary people, reshaped civilization more than any prophecy ever could. And perhaps that is the strangest lesson of all. The world does not change most when it ends, but when it almost does. When fear loosens certainty. When disappointment opens space for imagination. Have you noticed how much of our modern life is built on that same instinct to plan, to adapt, to keep going even when answers fail? That instinct was sharpened long ago in moments like these. As the noise of panic faded and the work of living resumed, humanity stepped forward carrying something new. Not confidence, not certainty, but resilience. And in the final moments of this story, we'll see how that quiet resilience became one of the most powerful forces history has ever known. The story slows here, not because Rome has run out of drama, but because it has reached the moment where power begins to crack under its own weight. By the late 3rd and 4th centuries, the empire is still vast on maps, still impressive in statues and speeches, but the numbers quietly tell another story. Tax records show declining yields from Italian farmland. Coin hoards unearthed by archaeologists reveal repeated debasement of silver currency. By the time of Emperor Gallienus, the silver content of the denarius has fallen to less than 5%, according to numismatic studies published by the British Museum. Money still circulates, but trust no longer does. Soldiers are paid more often in kind than in coin. Farmers hide grain. Officials inflate reports. Everyone senses that something is slipping, even if no one dares to say it out loud. The empire tries to adapt. Diocletian splits power between 4 rulers in the Tetrarchy, hoping management will succeed where glory failed. Constantine legalizes Christianity not purely from faith, but from calculation. A unifying belief is cheaper than endless legions. New capitals rise, old ones fade. Rome itself becomes a symbol rather than a command center, a stage set where senators debate tradition, while real decisions are made elsewhere. Historian Peter Brown later describes this period not as a sudden collapse, but as a long transformation, a reshaping of the Roman world rather than its disappearance. And yet there are moments that feel unmistakably final. In 410 AD, when Alaric's Visigoths sack Rome, Jerome writes from Bethlehem that the light of the world has been extinguished. It is an emotional exaggeration, but it captures the shock. For the first time in nearly 8 centuries, the eternal city is breached. Not burned to ash, not erased, but wounded, and wounds change how people remember you. By 476 AD, when the last Western Emperor Romulus Augustulus is quietly deposed, there is no grand battle, no dramatic speech. Just a letter sent east stating that an emperor is no longer needed in the West. Empires, it turns out, often end with paperwork. But here is the twist that makes Rome endlessly viral, endlessly fascinating. It does not really die. Roman law survives in Justinian's code. Roman roads remain under medieval dust. Roman ideas of citizenship architecture, calendars, even language echo through Europe and far beyond. When later civilizations build, they borrow Roman brick, sometimes literally. The empire falls, but the blueprint stays. So perhaps the real lesson is not about collapse, but about endurance. Rome reminds us that no system is eternal, yet influence can outlive power by centuries. Thank you for staying with this journey through time, for listening to the whispers beneath the marble. And if you think this story ends here, don't worry. Another chapter is already waiting for us just beyond the next horizon.